very much like to invite Mr. Ben Phillips to be with us. He will give us an idea of what works in practice, what inequality reduction efforts and results in different countries can be achieved. Mr. Phillips is an anti-inequality campaigner and author of many very topical publications. For instance, he is also author of How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. Thank you for being with us, and you have the floor.
So thank you very much for having me. It's really important, first of all, that the European Parliament is even hosting this session. The fact that you're doing so with this title and that Commissioner Urpilainen is here is itself a hugely important signal. Tackling inequality is now a mainstream, core political commitment of Europe. Civil society can now hold you to that pledge, and you'll be pleased to know that they will. I'm an activist, an organizer, a UN advisor, and an author on inequality, and I speak from all of those perspectives. Firstly, you are right to be very worried about inequality. Before COVID, around 7 in 10 people lived in countries where inequality was rising. Since COVID, it may well be 10 in 10. Now, this is not principally because of the health impacts, but because of the social and economic impacts. The ILO has noted that workers have lost $3.7 trillion in this crisis. Forbes magazine has noted that billionaires have gained $3.9 trillion. So there has been a transfer from workers to billionaires of around $4 trillion. At this time of acute need, most developing countries plan to slash spending on basic services. I want to repeat that. Most developing countries plan to slash spending on public services in the coming year. Nevertheless, my key message to you from history is that we should be optimists for action. For this book, How to Fight Inequality, I looked back at a century and a half of history, of evidence about how inequality can be successfully overcome. And the really good news is this: it can. We know what works. We have one real case from the 21st century and a lot of cases from the 20th century. In the 21st century, we have Latin America from about 2000 to about 2010 or 2015, where about 8 to 11 countries substantially reduced inequality. And then from the 20th century, we have many. We have newly independent African and Asian countries in the 50s and 60s. We have Europe from 1945 or before, and we have the US from the 1930s, amongst others. In that case, ending around 1975 or 1980. Now, the first thing to note, really crucial, is that inequality is a policy question. In all the history I looked through, no country had ever substantially or sustainably reduced inequality through community or NGO projects, through private initiative, through corporate social responsibility, or through market self-correction. None. It has always been through government policy. Now, there's no one silver bullet policy, but the policy mix is not a mystery. We could look at Brazil in the 2000s, and you see the following. Money put in the hands of ordinary people. So that could be child benefit, pensions, basic income, money. Secondly, wage increases and rights at work. That can be done by raising the minimum wage, by strengthening trade union rights, by strengthening the power of labour inspectors and labour laws. All of that was used in combination in Latin America. Thirdly, expanding public services. When you expand public services, you do three things. You strengthen human development, you take away a regressive tax, an effective regressive tax, because otherwise poor people are forced to buy private healthcare and education. And you also build a sense of community when people go to school together, use healthcare centres together, use transport together. Fourthly, progressive taxation, absolutely key. Many countries do not have a higher rate of income tax. They have a single rate of income tax. So, for example, in Kenya, a school teacher pays the same rate of income tax as a massive, a huge landowner. Land reform. Land reform has been key, especially in countries with a colonial or aristocratic history, so that land is not held only by a tiny few. And tackling discrimination, not only by banning the most egregious forms of racial and gender discrimination, but also through affirmative action policies to correct the history of discrimination. Now, interestingly, that mix, which was applied successfully in Latin America in the 21st century, you see parts of that mix also in all the other examples from the 20th century as well, including in the Europe and US, as well as in Africa and Asia. So the bigger issue, though, than the policy mix is this, the politics mix. And when I say politics mix, I don't mean this in a partisan sense. I merely mean the social processes that enable the policy shifts to reduce inequality. And the key is this. When I look back at the history, the policies were never dependent only on good leaders. They always required pressure from below, every single time. Even when there were good leaders, pressure was still needed. Lyndon B. Johnson famously said to Martin Luther King, "I know what I have to do, but you need to make me do it." In Brazil in the 2000s, it was the landless workers movement. In Bolivia, it was the indigenous peoples movement. In Ghana in the mid-20th century, as independence came, it was the cocoa workers. In the US in the mid-20th century, it was driven by a coalition, a Venn diagram of black organizations, trade unions, and activist group, with people like A. Philip Randolph as an exemplar of that. Now, what does all this mean, all this history mean for European support for tackling inequality in developing countries? It means three things. Firstly, it means supporting and enabling governments to provide public services, not off-budget projects. No country has ever become universally literate or had everyone finish school or got universal healthcare without the government doing it. None. Zero. Supporting countries means expanding their public services, which means ending user fees, and it also means making tax more progressive, including progressive income taxes, corporate taxes, not consumption taxes on poor people's food and fuel. And it means looking at wealth taxes. And you'll be delighted to know that there are even now millionaires who campaign for wealth taxes, for example, Millionaires for Humanity, who recognize the damage of an economy that fails to tax wealth and redistribute fairly. Secondly, it's about helping people hold government accountable. That doesn't mean the European Commission holding developing countries accountable. It means supporting civil society organizations, not as service providers, but as watchdogs, trackers, challengers. Now, this needs to be done in a way that doesn't have Europe seek to determine what civil society will do. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be supportive. We cannot have complex forms and painful bureaucracy which NGOize movements and commissionize NGOs. In other words, take people away from the active struggle for a fairer society and force them to become mini bureaucrats filling forms. We cannot have that. And we cannot have Europe direct it. It needs to be a deuteragonist, not a protagonist. In Oscar's terms, it needs to be the best supporting actor. Thirdly, it means that the impact of Europe on developing countries' inequality will not only, and even not mainly, be through Europe's development programs. It will be through the totality of policy. And so Europe should therefore seek to assess in advance and monitor in real time the impact of all of its policies on inequality. I just want to give a couple of examples that are really big right now. The IMF is allocating SDRs, special drawing rights. Europe could allocate those or transfer its allocation to developing countries to enable health and education to increase instead of decrease. There is a key debate going on now around debt suspension. There's been a partial debt suspension for some countries just to the end of this year. Europe could back a much bolder total debt freeze until the SDGs on health can be implemented. The debate on the vaccine patent waiver and the transfer of technology. I have to tell you, spare doses will not do it. There are 8 billion people. Anyone who starts an argument with we are distributing tens of millions of doses is saying 8 billion will not get served. And if 8 billion will not get served, I guarantee you the poor will come last. So you increase inequality when you increase vaccine inequity. And if you do not move to tech transfer and patent waiver, and you simply do doses, you will deny people not only their right to life and safety, but you also hold countries in a dysfunctional economic situation that they're now in. The discussion on tax havens and tax avoidance. We need to ensure that if developing countries lack the resources to look after their people, that's not because the money is kept in bank accounts of European member states. We always have to bear in mind that whenever scarcity is increased or austerity is imposed, inequality will rise. Lastly, I just want to say one historical word on crises. Historically, crises have been hugely consequential on inequality, but they can lead either to a big decrease or to a big increase. We know that 1929 led to transformational positive change in America and transformational disruptive and painful and awful change in Europe. We know that the 2008 crisis did not lead to any significant action on tackling inequality. So what will happen in this crisis? We can think of crises a bit like heat. So the blacksmith or the glassblower applies heat to the metal or glass. The formerly hard structure becomes bendable, but in which direction will it bend? That depends on which direction it is pushed. We can sometimes feel as citizens that inequality is fate. History shows it is not. And likewise, we can sometimes feel as citizens that what happens on inequality will be determined by a few great leaders. History shows that has never been the case. Inequality has always and only ever been beaten by ordinary people working together, challenging power, building power, generating a new story. So none of us are spectators. All of us are on the pitch. And we can win this together. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your inspiring contribution, Ben Phillips. We are all on the pitch. Here's the challenge. I read you with your messages. We should be bold. We should be innovative. We should monitor exactly what we are doing and readjust our initiatives. And that is, I think, a full arena worthwhile to be debated now. My understanding is that we have not any connection to Stephanie Blankenburg.